Hi everyone, it's Ray, Singing Tallit, picking up once again, and we're continuing our reading of The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah by Alfred Edersheim. Again, this is a very long, very dense, very thorough book. This is the unabridged version too, so it's about 1,000 pages long with about 200 pages at the end of appendixes and annotations and such. This is the kind of book that is probably more like the doctorate thesis type of book, but you know what? We're going to read it anyways because we love Yeshua and we love the Father, and we love knowing more and more and more about the world at the time of the first century in Jerusalem and in Alexandria and in Babylon, the three main hubs of Jewish life in the world at the time. Chapter 3, Book 2, The Annunciation of St. John the Baptist. It was the time of the morning sacrifice. As the massive temple gates slowly swung on their hinges, a threefold blast from silver trumpets of priests seemed to waken the city, as with the voice of God, to the light of another day. As it echoes came through the still air and across the cleft of the Tyropeon, up the slopes of the upper city, down the busy quarters below, or away to the new suburb beyond. They must, if but for a moment, have brought holier thoughts to all. For did it not seem to link the present to the past and the future, as with a golden chain of promises that bound the holy city of Jerusalem that was above, which in type had already and in reality would soon descend from heaven? Patriot, saint, or stranger, he could not have heard it unmoved as thrice the summons came from within the temple gates as it rose and fell. So he's saying that at the time of the morning sacrifice, they'd blow silver trumpets to let everybody know that the sacrifice was being made. And of course, this is the sacrifice that John the Baptist's dad was getting to participate in. It had not come too soon. The Levites on ministry and those of the laity, whose course it was to act as the representative of Israel, whether in Palestine or far away, in a sacrifice provided and offered for all Israel, and they hastened to their duties. For already the blush of dawn, for which the priest on the highest pinnacle of the temple had watched, to give the signal for the beginning of the service of the day, had shot its brightness far away to Hebron and beyond. Within the courts below, all had long been busy, at some time previously unknown to those who waited for the morning, whether at cock-crowing, or earlier, or later, according to the Talmud 1:2. The superintending priests had summoned to their sacred function those who had, quote, washed according to the ordinance. There must have been each day about 50 priests on duty, such of them as were ready now divided into two parties, to make inspection of the temple courts by torchlight. Presently they met, and trooped to the well-known hall of hewn polished stones, according to Yoma 25a, where formerly the Sanhedrin had been wont to sit. The ministry for the day was there apportioned, to prevent the disputes of carnal zeal, and the lot was to be assigned to each function. 4 times was it resorted, twice before and twice after the temple gates were opened. The first act of their ministry had to be done in the gray dawn, by the fitful red light that glowed on the altar of the burnt offering. Ere the priests had stirred it with a fresh flame, it was scarcely daybreak when a second time they met for the lot, which designated those who were to take part in the sacrifice, and who were to trim the golden candlestick, and make ready the altar of incense within the holy place. And now morning had broken, and nothing remained before the admission of worshippers, but to bring out the lamb, once again to make sure of its fitness for sacrifice, to water it from the golden bowl, and then to lay it in a mystic fashion, as tradition described the binding of Isaac, on the north side of the altar, with its face to the west. So we're reading a description of the morning sacrifice, the Tamid offering that's being made. This is the chance when a man who's actually in the service at the temple could actually have the lot cast and might actually become the person who gets to go in and do the work. Now, this is a once-in-a-lifetime honor. Any person who got to do this was only allowed to do it once. even if the lot, you weren't allowed to participate in the lot again after you had got to do it for one time. So there's always going to be some people who were never able to go into that place and to do those special duties, because you got to remember there are thousands of Levite priests. All priests and laity were present as the priest, standing on the east side of the altar, from a golden bowl sprinkled with sacrificial blood, the two sides of the altar, below the red line which marked the difference between the ordinary sacrifices and those which were to be wholly consumed. While the sacrifice was prepared for the altar, the priest, whose lot it was, had made ready all within the holy place, where the most solemn part of the day's service was to take place, that of the offering of incense, which symbolized Israel's accepted prayers. Again was the lot, for the third time, cast to indicate him who was to be honored with this highest mediatorial act. Only once in a lifetime might anyone enjoy that privilege. Henceforth he was called rich, and must leave to his brethren the hope of the distinction which had been granted to him. It was fitting that, as the custom was, such lot should be preceded by prayer and a confession of their faith on the part of the assembled priests. So he's repeating actually what I said, that this honor that was about to fall on John the Baptist's daddy was so great that you were called the rich priest when you were the one who actually got to go and make that incense offering. And it can only be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Once it had happened to you, that's your turn. Let somebody else do it, because this is the most honored thing that a regular priest can do. Remember, a high priest is the one that gets to do the certain things. Even though, honestly, it says in the, I believe it's in the Talmud, it says that if the high priest was not available, any regular priest could actually do the high priest duty. If there was no high priest that was available, of course, you want to make sure there's a high priest available. Excuse me. It was the first week in October, 748 AUC, that is, in the 6th year before our present era, when the course of Abiai, the 8th in the original arrangement of the weekly service, was on duty in the temple. True this, as indeed most of the 24 courses into which the priesthood had been arranged could not claim identity, only continuity, with those whose names they bore. For only 3, or at most 4, of the ancient courses had returned from Babylon, but the original arrangement had been preserved, and the names of the missing courses being retained, and their number filled up by lot from those among the other houses that came back from Palestine. In our ignorance of the number of the houses of their father, or the families which constituted the course of Abiai, it is impossible to determine how the services of that week had been apportioned among them. But this is of comparatively small importance, since there is no doubt about the central figure in the scene. So he's pointed out here that even though David had divided the courses into the 24 different courses, and each of them had been named for, I guess, a father of the course, when they returned from Babylon, many priests did not return. If you recall, I believe it's in Nehemiah, might be in Ezra, that when the priests were returning, they had to leave their brides, their Babylonian wives, and their Babylonian children that they had had in Babylon behind to become priests of the Most High God again. And I think 5,000, can't remember how many, but a certain number of priests swore the oath and left behind their wives and children and said, it's more important that we go and be priests of the Most High God than that we have our own families that we had before. So that's a big sacrifice for your daddy to look in the eye and say, son, I don't want you no more because I need to go and serve God, and you can't come with me. So that's a hard sacrifice. In the group ranged, and the point is that many of the priests could not make that sacrifice. They could not walk away from their families. They did not have the will to cause that much pain to their beloved children and to the wives that loved them and they had cared for so long. That's why there were so few of these priests that actually returned from Babylon. In the group ranged that autumn morning around the superintending priest was one on whom the snows of at least 60 winters had fallen. But never during these many years had he been honored with the office of incensing. It was perhaps well he should have learned that this distinction came direct from God. Yet the venerable figure of Zacharias must have been well known in the temple, for each course was twice a year on ministry, and unlike the Levites, the priests were not disqualified by age, but only by infirmity. In many respects he seemed different from those around. His home was not in either of the great priest centers, the Ophel quarter of Jerusalem, nor in Jericho, but in some small town in the uplands south of Jerusalem, the historic, quote, hill country of Judea. And yet he might have claimed distinction. To be a priest and married to the daughter of a priest was supposed to convey a twofold honor, that he was surrounded by relatives and friends, and that he was well known and respected throughout his district, appears incidentally from the narrative in Luke. It would indeed have been strange had it been otherwise. There was much in the popular habits of thought, as well as in the office of the privileges of the priesthood, if worthy representative, to invest it with a veneration which the aggressive claims of rabbinism could not wholly monopolize. And in this instance, Zacharias and Elizabeth, his wife, were truly, quote, righteous, in the sense of walking, so far as a man could be judged, blamelessly, alike in those commandments which were specially binding in Israel, and those statutes that were of universal binding on all mankind. No doubt their piety assumed in some measure the form of the time, being, as if we must use the expression, Pharisaic, though in the good, not the evil sense of the word. And Pharisee comes from, was it paresis, which in Hebrew means to be separated, or set apart ones, basically. That's where the term Pharisee comes from. So he's saying that the John the Baptist's daddy, Zacharias, he is definitely in the bloodline of Aaron. He's from the family, probably from the family of Moses directly. I'm not exactly sure who his family is, but it probably says so somewhere. But he definitely qualifies as a priest. He is not simply a Levite, which is the tribe that was slave to the high priest, but he's actually in the family line of the priest. His wife also is in the family line of Aaron. So these guys are as high up the totem pole of bloodline-born righteousness as you can get. Maybe I shouldn't use the word totem pole while I'm describing these things. That is a North American euphemism that we picked up from the Native Americans, for people who may not know what a totem pole is. There is much about these earlier rabbis, Hillel, Gamliel, and others, to attract us, and their spirit oftentimes sharply contrasts with the narrow bigotry, the self-glory, and the unspiritual externalism of their successors. We may not unreasonably infer that the Sadiq in the quiet home of the hill country was quite other than the self-asserting rabbi, whose dress and gait, voice and manner, words and even prayers were those of a religious parvenu, pushing his claims to distinction before the angels and men. Such a household as that of Zacharias and Elizabeth would have all that was beautiful in the religion of the time, devotion towards God, a home of affection and purity, and reverence towards all that was sacred in the things divine, human, ungrudging, self-denying, loving charity to the poor, the tenderest regard for the feelings of others, so as not to raise a blush nor to wound their hearts. And he shows the footnote of why he would say that. Above all, intense faith and hope in the higher, in a better future for Israel. Of such indeed there must have been not a few in the land, quiet, the prayerful, the pious, who certainly, not being Sadducees nor Essenes, but reckoned with the Pharisaic party, waited for the consolation of Israel and received it with joy when manifested. Nor could aught more certainly have there marked the difference between the one and the other section than on a matter which must almost daily and most painfully have forced it and itself upon Zacharias and Elizabeth. There were among the rabbis those who, remembering the words of the prophet from Malachi 2:13, spoke in most pathetic language of the wrong of parting from the wife of your youth. And he quotes the Talmudic verse there. And there were those whom the bare fact of childlessness rendered separation a religious duty. And he again quotes the Talmudic verse here. Elizabeth was childless for many a year. This must have been the burden of Zacharias' prayer. the burden also of reproach, which Elizabeth seemed always to carry with her, that they waited together these many years, till in the evening of life the flower of hope had closed its fragrant cup, and still the two sat together in twilight, content to wait in loneliness till the night would close around them. And that's his way of saying until they died. What he's pointing out here is that the Pharisees, and this is modern Orthodox Judaism, if you marry a woman, she doesn't give you a child within 2 years, you have the right to divorce her because she's left you childless. Okay, so he's saying at the time, this was already in practice among the Pharisees, that if a woman cannot produce children for you, you have the right to, in fact, not just the right, but the duty to leave her, because, of course, the first real commandment that you get is to be fruitful and multiply. So if you can't be fruitful and multiply, then you need to get out of the way, basically. If somebody in the relationship is preventing children from happening, then you just need to move on to a different relationship. That's what they're implying in the teachings of the Pharisees at the time. But, of course, Zacharias obviously didn't care what they thought and just stayed with his wife, because he probably figured it was better that he just stay with the wife of his youth, and one day Yehovah will either give him children or they'll just die together, and that'll be that's just what life is, right? But on that bright morning in the temple, no such thoughts would come to Zacharias. For the first and for the last time in life, the lot had marked him for incensing, and every thought must have centered on what was before him. Even outwardly, all attention would be requisite for the proper performance of his office. First, he had chose the two of his special friends or relatives to assist in his sacred service. Their duties were comparatively simple. One reverently removed what had been left on the altar from the previous evening service, then, worshipping, retired backwards. The second assistant now advanced, and having spread to the outermost edge of the golden altar the live coals taken from it, that of a burnt offering, worshipped and then retired. Meanwhile, the sound of the organ, the magrafa, heard to the most distant parts of the temple, and according to the tradition, far beyond its precincts, had summoned priests, Levites, and people to prepare for whatever service or duty was to befall them, for this was the innermost part of the worship of the day. But the celebrant priest, bearing the golden censer, this referring to the one who actually gets to go in and make the offering, stood alone within the holy place, lit by the sheen of the 7-branched candlestick. Before him, somewhat far away, towards the heavy veil that hung before the Holy of Holies, was the golden altar of incense, on which the red coals glowed. To his right, the left of the altar, that is, on the north side, was the table of showbread, and to his left, on the right or south side of the altar, was the golden candlestick. Still he waited, as instructed to do, till a special signal indicated that the moment had come to spread the incense on the altar, as near as possible to the Holy of Holies. Priests and people had reverently withdrawn from the neighborhood to the altar, where prostrate before the Lord, offering unspoken worship in which record of past deliverance, longing for mercies promised in the future, and entreaty for present blessings and peace, seemed the ingredients of the incense that rose in a fragrant cloud to the praise and prayer. Deep silence had fallen on the worshippers as they had watched to heaven and prayed for Israel, ascending as the cloud of odors that rose from the golden altar in the holy place. And this is referenced in the book of Revelation. Zechariah waited until he saw the incense kindling. Then he also would have bowed down in worship and reverently withdrawn, had not a wondrous sight arrested his steps. So at this point, he has gone in by himself. They've cleared out everybody that's in the holy place. It's just the menorah, just the table of showbread, and just the altar of incense, and just him walking back towards the veil where the altar of incense is. And at the right moment, he's supposed to put the incense on the altar so that it can smolder and burn properly, and then he's supposed to bow down and worship and, leave the presence of God in that sense. But that's not how it ended up for him. Excuse me. On the right side of the altar, that is the south side, between it and the golden candlestick, stood what could not be recognized as what he could not but recognize as an angelic form. Never indeed even tradition reported such a vision to an ordinary priest in the act of incensing. The two supernatural apparitions recorded, one was the angel each year on the pontificate of Simon the Just, the other in that blasphemous account of the vision of the Almighty by Ishmael, the son of Elisha, and in the conversation which then ensued, had both been vouched to high priests and on the Day of Atonement. Still there was always an uneasiness among the people as to any mortal approach the immediate presence of God, and every delay in his return seemed ominous. So what they're saying is that the only other times any kind of apparition was ever reported to have taken place within the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur by the high priest. That's the only place that an angel had ever spoke to anybody. And they say basically since these appearances eventually were trickling off to never happening again, is what people probably thought, it was considered ominous that God was no longer making his presence known. No wonder then, that Zacharias was troubled, and fear fell on him, as of a sudden, probably just after he had spread the incense on the altar and was about to offer his parting prayer, he beheld what afterwards he knew to be the angel Gabriel, that is considered the might of God, apparent and apart from higher considerations. There could perhaps be no better evidence of the truth of this narrative than its accord with the psychological effects. The apocryphal narrative would probably have painted the scene as an ingredient with what, in the view of such a writer, should have been the feelings of Zacharias and the language of the angel. The angel would have commenced by referencing to Zacharias' prayers for the coming of a Messiah. Zacharias would have been represented in a highly enthusiastic state, instead of the strangely prosaic objection which he offered to the angelic announcement. There would have been a burst of spiritual sentiment of what passed for such, but all this would have been psychologically untrue. There are moments in mortal faintness, so to speak, when the vital powers of the spiritual heart are depressed, and, as in the case of the disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration and in the Garden of Gethsemane, the physical part of our being and all that is at its weakest in us assert their power. So what he's saying here is, you would think that when Zacharias, this priest who had waited his whole life, 60-year-old man waited his whole life for this opportunity to finally get to go make the sacrifice, not only does he go in and make a sacrifice, but an angel appears to him, and you would think that his reaction would be, "Oh wow, I'm the one. I get to. He must be coming to tell me about Messiah." And yet the angel says to him, "Your wife's going to give birth," and he's like, "Well, that can't be right." And then he's like, "What? Did you say I can't be right? You're never going to speak again. Name the child John, and when you get done naming him, then you'll be able to speak again. You'll be mute. I think it's deaf and mute until such time as that." So basically, the angel made sure that the last words he heard until he did what he was told were the last words the angel spoke to him. It was to this state of semi-consciousness that the angel first awakened within Zacharias the remembrance of lifelong prayers and hopes, which had now passed into the background of his being, and then suddenly startled him by the promise of their realization. So it's like, you remember how you've been asking your whole life that you would have children? Do you remember when you keep asking constantly to have children? Well, okay, it's time. You're going to get to have that child you want. But the child of so many prayers, who was to bear the significant name of Yochanan, or that is to say, the Lord is gracious, was to be the source of joy and gladness to the far wider circle than just his family. This might be called the first rung of the ladder by which the angel would have taken the priest upwards. Nor is this followed by an immediate disclosure of what in such a place and from such a messenger must have carried to a believing heart the thrill of almost unspeakable emotion. Rather was Zacharias led upward step by step. The child was to be great before Jehovah, not only an ordinary, but a lifelike Nazarite. As Samson and as Samuel had been of old, like them, he was not to consecrate himself, but from the inception of a life wholly belonging to God, for his work, and greater than either of these representatives of the symbolic import of the Nazarene, he would combine the twofold meaning of their mission, both outward and inward, the might that is in God, only in a higher and more spiritual sense. For his life work, he would be filled with the Holy Ghost from the moment life woke within him. Then as another Samson would he, in the strength of God, lift the axe to the tree to be felled, and, like another Samuel, turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord God to light their way. Nay, combining of these two missions, as did Elijah on Mount Carmel, he should, in accordance with prophecy, Malachi 3:1, here he cites prophecy, precede the messianic manifestation, and not indeed in the person or in form, but in the spirit and the power of Elijah, accomplish the typical meaning of his mission. As on that day of decision it had risen as a burden of prayers, 1 Kings 18, that is, in the words of prophecy, Malachi 4:5, quote, he would turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, which in the view of the coming dispensation would be, quote, the disobedient to walk in the wisdom of the just, according to Luke and Matthew. Thus would this new Elijah, quote, make ready for the Lord a people prepared. So he's saying that as the angel speaking to John the Baptist's father, he says, your son's going to live the life of a Nazarite. You're never going to cut his hair. He's never going to touch grapes. He's going to maintain a level of purity that is even higher than the high priest must maintain. If you ever read Alfred Edersheim's The Templist Ministries, it talks about how a Nazarite vow would make which is why they're short term, by the way. Nazarite vow is usually like 30 days. It's a short term, and never usually more than 180 days, by the way. A Nazarite vow requires you to have such a high level of ritual purity that even the high priest himself does not have to maintain as much. For instance, if you're a Nazarite and a person dies in your presence, it's over. You lose. You've lost the vow. You had nothing to do with it. They were just near you when they died. That's all it took, and you're done. And you didn't have to touch them. You didn't have to walk into the house with them. They just had to die near you. I don't know exactly how near, but probably within the same home as you were. Probably within. They probably had it paced off. Honestly, how close they had to be, knowing the Pharisees. But if someone even died within your presence, if you touched a grape, if you touched wine, if you touched a raisin, if you got into anything, probably anything that was dyed with any kind of grape juice or anything like that. Needless to say, the way Edersheim says it, he says the taboos concerning the Nazarite were even greater than the taboos concerning the office of the high priest. If the apparition of an angel in that place and at that time had overwhelmed the aged priest, the words which he heard must have filled him with such bewilderment that from the moment he scarcely realized their meaning. One idea alone, which had struck its roots so long in its consciousness, stood out: a sun, while as it were in the dim distance beyond, stretched as covered with the mist of glory all those marvelous things that were to be connected with him. So, when age or strong feelings renders us almost insensible to the present, it is ever that which connects itself to the past rather than with the present which emerges first and strongest in our consciousness. And so it was the obvious doubt that would suggest itself from which fell his lips, almost unconscious of what he said, yet there was in his words an element of faith also, or at least of hope, as he asked for some pledge or confirmation of what he had heard. So that's where he says to the angel, well, no, that can't be right. And it is this demand of some visible sign by which to know all that the angel had promised, which distinguishes the doubt of Zacharias from that of Abraham, or of Manoah, and his wife from Judges 13. Under somewhat similar circumstances, although otherwise also, even a cursory reading must convey the impression of a most marked difference. Nor ought we perhaps to forget that we are at the threshold of a dispensation to which faith is the only entrance. This door Zacharias has now to hold ajar, a dumb messenger. He that would not speak the praises of God, but asked a sign, received it. So basically what he's saying here is that when Zacharias the priest, who is literally speaking to an angel, and instead of just saying, oh my gosh, thank you so much, please tell Jehovah how much I love him, thank you for sending this message, thank you for, letting me have the child I always wanted. He was like, I need a sign to evidence that you're the real deal, because, Satan comes as angel's light, and maybe you're lying to me. And the angel's like, you want a sign? I'll give you a sign. You won't speak, and you won't hear again until you do what I told you to do. That's your sign. Here's your sign. His dumbness was a sign, though a sign, as it were, the dumb child of a prayer of unbelief. Was it a punishment also? And yet, when rightly applied, a sign in another sense also, a sign of the waiting multitude in the temple, a sign to Elizabeth, to all who knew Zacharias in the hill country, and to the priest himself during those 9 months of retirement and inward solitude, a sign also that would kindle into fiery flame in the day when God would loosen his tongue. So we had just read how, as he was doing this offering of incense, everybody was hushed. There was a hushed silence right at the temple because everybody's dead quiet. He's going in there. He's going to make this offering, right? So now his entire life up to the birth of his son becomes a dead quiet until this event happens. When he fulfills the duty that was given to him, then he's allowed to hear again. Then sound returns to his life. Prior to that, no sound, dead silence, waiting, like not ominous, but a reverent silence, in his own life. That's basically what he's saying, is that it's not even necessarily a punishment, but the sign is basically like the angel saying, you hear how everybody's dead silent while I'm talking to you right now? Everything's going to be dead silent until you do what you should do. A period of unusual length had passed since the signal for incensing had been given. The prayers of the people had been offered, and their anxious gaze was directed towards the holy place. And at last Zacharias emerged to take his stand on the top steps, which led from the porch to the court of the priests. Waiting to lead in the priestly benediction, which is in Numbers 6:24. By the way, number 6 is also where the Nazirite vow is. That preceded the daily meat offering and the chant of the psalms of the praise, accompanied with joyous sounds of music, as the drink offering was poured out. But already the sign of Zacharias was to be a sign to all people. The pieces of the sacrifice had been arranged in due order on the altar of burnt offering. The priest stood on the steps of the porch, and the people were in waiting. Zacharias essayed to speak the words of the benediction, unconscious that the stroke had fallen. But the people knew it by his silence, that he had seen a vision in the temple. Yet as he stood helpless, trying by signs to indicate it in an awestruck assembly, he remained dumb. So literally, he tried to speak, but he couldn't speak. Nothing came out. And then he started gesturing to people. He couldn't speak and he couldn't hear. And at that point, people were like, "Oh, he saw some kind of vision. Like God must have spoke to him while he was in there." Wondering, they had dispersed, people and priests. The day's service over, another family of ministrants took the place of those among whom Zacharias had been, and again, at the close of the week's service, another course, that of Abiai. They returned to their homes, and some to Ophel, and some to Jericho, and some to their quiet dwellings in the country. But God fulfilled the word which he had spoken by his angel. Before leaving this subject, it may be well to inquire into the relation between the events just described and the customs and expectations of the time. The scene in the temple and all the surroundings are in the strictest accordance with what we know of the services of the sanctuary. In a narrative that lays hold on some details of a very complex service, such entire accuracy conveys the impression of general truthfulness. Similarly, the sketch of Zacharias and Elizabeth is true to the history of the time. though Zacharias could not have been one of the, quote, learned, nor one of the rabbinists. He was a model priest. They would have described him, the rabbis would have probably described him as an idiot, or a common, or a anhum aretz, a rustic. And we've read this. Remember, it's just told you Zacharias is a little he's in the priestly family line, but he's a nobody from a little village south of Jerusalem that is not a place where the learned Pharisees are at. I don't even know if they have a synagogue in the village. I mean, they probably do. It's usually got to be within a Sabbath day's journey of everybody's house. But what he's saying is that the rabbis probably would have referred to him as an ignorant man who just happened to be born by his genetics into the priestly line, and that was the only reason he was there at the temple. Didn't have anything to do with his personal righteousness or his personal understanding of what the scripture was. Because the Pharisee, it was very important to understand not just the word itself, but the mysteries that were hidden within the word and the oral tradition which described how to properly walk out the word of the Torah. So what he's saying, reminding us here, is that the Pharisees probably would have described this priest as a common dirt farming man who just happened to be born into the priestly line. All right, so here we go. A rustic priest, and treated him with a benevolent contempt. So basically, when the benevolent contempt is to say basically, don't listen to Zacharias to know about, what the scriptures say or any of that kind of stuff. That's not his thing. He just goes and does priestly service because he was raised to, and his family, and it's what they do. We'll teach the people, Zacharias, just go to the temple and make your offerings and, do that. You can tell from the way Edersheim writes that he has a definite disdain for the Pharisees in general as being self-righteous, puffed up, etc., etc. But of course, sooner or later he's going to have to face the fact that Rabbi Yeshua is also in the Pharisaic group and also quotes Hillel a lot, and he will. He's going to talk about a lot of that. Don't forget this guy is an Anglican priest, so I mean, there is a vein of anti-Semitism, even though he's also a Jew. There is a vein of anti-Judaism running through what he says. So I'll try to dig it out as it comes so we can discuss it. All right, so the angelic apparition which he saw was wholly unprecedented and could therefore not have lain within the range of the common expectation, though the possibility, or rather the fear, of some contact with the divine was always present in the popular mind. So even today, people will tell you that when the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, that if he didn't do it just right, then, God would strike him down and kill him. And that's why they had to put tie a rope to him, and they drag him back out from under the veil if he didn't come out on his own because he was dead. It was a part of the popular mythological culture at the time that you better be real careful when you're in the temple because you never know when God's going to show up or he's going to hand down one of his angels to have him go kill a bunch of priests because they're not doing things right. Like how Aaron's two sons, it was Ithamar and Abiyahu, is that his name? I think it was Ithamar and Abiyahu, who were the ones who were killed for what they did, and then Eleazar and the other son became the two sons that were to carry on the priestly line. But it was difficult to conceive how, if not true, the invention of such a vision in such circumstances could have suggested itself. This difficulty is enhanced by the obvious difference between the evangelic narrative and the popular ideas of the time. Far too much importance has been attached by a certain class of writers to rabbinic sayings, and he quotes several rabbinical sources here, that the names of angels were brought from Babylon. For not only was this saying of Ben Lachish only a clever scriptural deduction, as the context shows, and not even an actual tradition, but no competent critic would venture to lay down the principle that isolated rabbinic sayings in the Talmud are to be regarded as sufficient foundation for historical facts. On the other hand, the rabbinic tradition does lay it down that the names of the angels were derived from their mission and might be changed with it. Thus the reply of the angel to the inquiry of Manoah in Judges 13:18 is explained as implying that He knew not what the other name might have been given to him in the future. In the book of Daniel, in which the son of Lachish refers, the only two angelic names mentioned are that of Gabriel, Daniel 9, and of Michael, Daniel 10, while the appeal to the book of Daniel as evidenced of the Babylonish origins of the Jewish angelology, in other words, the study of the angels, comes with strange inconsistency from writers who date it to Maccabean times. So people who like and dig into the book of Enoch, it's probably written around 300 BC, which is the beginning of the Maccabean time period when the Greeks were ruling over Israel. And that is probably where that book actually originates from. But the question of angelic nomenclature is quite secondary. The real point at issue is whether or not the angelology and demonology of the New Testament was derived from contemporary Judaism. The opinion that such was the case has been dogmatically asserted as to have also passed among a certain class as settled fact. That nevertheless such was not the case is capable of the most ample proof. Here also the similarity from and slighter than usual, there is an absolute contrast of substance. So he's saying that, like it says that the angel that spoke to him, like we just read, that was Gabriel, right? So Gabriel spoke to him. So God's strength comes and speaks to him. But according to the Pharisees of the time, when he probably would have said, well, the angel Gabriel come and spoke to him, they're like, well, are you sure it was the angel Gabriel? You know, what if it was the Metatron? What if it was this? You know, how do you know it was that angel? Did he tell you his name when you spoke to him? And then they would say, well, and then another rabbi would have argued, well, the angels change names with the purpose that they have. Their name is just an expression of what they're there to do. They don't really have names. And then another rabbi would be like, oh, no, they do have names, and we discerned what all of them were while we were in exile in Babylon. And Rabbi Lachish had clearly stated that they are named this and this and that. You know, this is the kind of stuff that people argue about, which is completely pointless and doesn't have anything to do with the matter at hand, which is the fact that an angel appeared to Zacharias and gave him instructions on what he was supposed to do. Admitting the names of Gabriel and Michael must have been familiar to the mind of Zacharias, some not important differences must be kept in view. Thus, Gabriel was regarded in tradition as inferior to Michael, and, though both were connected with Israel, Gabriel was represented as chiefly a minister of justice, and Michael a minister of mercy. While thirdly, Gabriel was supposed to stand on the left, and not, as in most the evangelic narrative, on the right side of the throne of glory. Small as these divergences may seem, they were all important when derivation of the one set of opinions from another is in question. So he's saying that it might not seem important that the angel Gabriel sat on the left side and the angel Michael was supposed to sit on the right side. And if you recall, the two angels, the cherubim that are over the Ark of the Covenant, they would say, well, one was Michael and one was Gabriel, right? And if you didn't know which one was which, then there was something wrong with you because you didn't understand the mysteries that were being expressed to you at the time. All right, so all important when the derivation of one set of opinions might from another be in question. Finally, as regarded the coming of Elijah as a forerunner of the Messiah, it is to be observed that, according to Jewish notions, he was to appear personally and not merely in spirit and in power. In fact, tradition represents his ministry and appearances as almost continuous, not only immediately before the coming of Messiah, but at all times. I'll tell you something interesting. Every Passover, when the Jews do the Seder meal, they're to leave one seat aside for Elijah to come, and that's Elijah's seat. So they send the youngest member of the household out to the front. They start the ceremony right. And at a certain moment, they send the youngest boy in the household out to the front door to go and answer the door and to invite Elijah to come in. Okay? Well, obviously, Elijah doesn't come in. However, I will tell you that Nehemiah Gordon, with tears in his eyes, said that when that ceremony was performed at his house when he was a child, that he opened the door and there was a man there at the door, and that man was Elijah that was there at the door. And I can't remember what he said that man said to him, but I honestly believe him. there's something very special about what's going on there, and I wonder if Elijah really did appear to him to begin him on a course in his life that's going to... I mean, the man says he's a Karaite Jew, but he spends most of his time explaining the gospel of the kingdom to people who aren't even yet fully aware that they want to become a follower of Yeshua. He spends most of his time explaining what Yeshua was talking about to people, which seems odd. And sometimes I wonder if Paul was in that same boat, trying to explain to these people how to become a Pharisee and how to become a member of Israel, and then one day saying, you know what? I think that I really believe in Yeshua. Of course, it said he had a vision on the road, and I don't know if Nehemiah's had a vision on the road yet. So maybe one day, maybe he'll be in a plane crash or something and be the only survivor or something. Say, I had a vision. You know, who knows? Anyways, not merely in spirit and power, but in fact, tradition represents his ministry and appearance as almost continuous, not only immediately before the coming of Messiah, but at all times. Rabbinical writings introduce him on the scene, not only frequently, but on the most incongruous occasions, and for the most diverse purposes. In this sense, it is said of him that he has always lived. This is in Moed K 26a. Sometimes, indeed, he is blamed as if for closing words in his prayer about the turning of the heart of the people, and even his sacrifice on Carmel was only excused on the grounds of an express command. But his great activity as a precursor of the Messiah is to resolve doubts of all kinds, to reintroduce those who had been violently and improperly extruded from the congregation of Israel, and vice versa, to make peace, while finally he was connected with the raising of the dead. But nowhere is he prominently designated as intended to, quote, to make ready the Lord a people prepared. So it basically what it's saying here is that in the rabbinic writings at the time, in the oral, well, I guess they were oral, they weren't rabbinic. The Talmud wasn't written, but it was being spoken, mouth to ear between the Pharisees and their disciples. Nowhere does it say that Elijah is going to come and do this thing, that the angel said, your son's going to be like Elijah. He's going to make the people ready for the coming of their Messiah. So the Pharisees were like, look, he's done all kind of things according to what we say about him, but that's not one of them. So maybe you got the wrong angel or something like that. Thus, from whatever source the narrative may be supposed to have been derived, its details certainly differ, in almost all particulars from the theological notions current at the time. And the more Zacharias meditated on this in the long solitude of his enforced silence, and more fully must new spiritual thoughts have come to him. As for Elizabeth, those tender feelings of woman, which ever shrink from the disclosure of the dearest secret of motherhood, would intensely deepen and sanctify in the knowledge of all that had passed. Little as she might have understand the full meaning of the future, it must have been to her as if she had now stood in the holy place, gazing towards the veil which concealed the innermost presence. Meantime she was content with any, and felt the need of, absolute retirement from other fellowship than that of with God in her own heart. Like her husband, she too would be silent, alone, until another voice called her forth. Whatever the future might bring, sufficient for the present, and thus the Lord had been to her in the days in which he looked down to remove her reproach from among men. The removal of that burden, its manner, its meaning, its end, were all from God, and with God, and it was the fitting to be quiet and alone, till God's voice would again wake the echoes within. And so 5 months passed in absolute retirement. It's the end of the chapter. So what he's saying there is, Zacharias and Elizabeth both retired back to their home and just stayed out of public life while she was pregnant. I mean, this woman's 60-year-old woman pregnant. I mean, yes, she's probably going to stay probably needs to be on home rest. I'm sure the local doctor would be like, you got to go home and rest because you shouldn't even be able to be pregnant this late in life. But it has actually happened. There have been 60-year-old women who have given birth to healthy children. It's definitely not an impossibility by any means. So he goes to her I guess makes signs to her that she's going to get pregnant, or probably writes it down on the slate or something like that, whatever they would have used to write it down on. They go kind of withdraw from the public completely, and the man's just deaf. Ain't going to be undeaf, ain't going to be able to speak until his child is actually born, and he gives him the appropriate name he's supposed to give him. And you can only imagine what it's like for this woman who's waited, I'm assuming probably 40 years to give her husband a child, and to have herself a child. And now they've withdrawn. Of course, probably the next thing we're going to see is when Mary, who also has this strange miraculous pregnancy with an angel telling her something, comes to see Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's baby, it says, turned over in her stomach to acknowledge the presence that the Messiah was near to him. So all in all, again, we're reading the life and times of Jesus the Messiah, and we're now 100 pages into the book, and we're actually we just stopped at page 101, and we're beginning to see the actual appearance of Yeshua's hopefully soon to come in the book. I don't know. I've never read the book before. I've read The Temple and Its Ministry of Service, which is an excellent book. I've read Sketches of Jewish Social Life, which is an excellent book. Every one of these books that I have read from Edersheim have been like revelations. I'm talking about these books are mind-blowing in the amount of information that they contain. It will change Here's the problem. A lot of people read the Bible and they say, well, I already understand everything I need to know about life, so I'm going to read it and I'm going to understand it in terms of who I am right now, and I'm going to make everything that I see here fit who I am right now. Unfortunately, that is incorrect, because who you are right now is a baby child beginning to come to terms with the world around them. And when you're a baby child and you've just learned to walk, and you got people holding your arms and walking you around, helping you, don't touch that knife, or don't touch the hot stove, don't stick your finger in a power outlet, slapping your hand every time you try to do something that's wrong, telling you don't do this, don't do that, and then hugging you and holding you all the time, picking you up and carrying you around. That's happening to you all the time with God, and you just don't even realize it, because when you're a baby child, you think as a child. You don't think like an adult, you think as a child. You think everything's hunky-dory, everything's perfect, I'm always safe, I'm always going to have everything I want, I don't lack anything, and if I want something, it's going to be given to me, I can scream and cry and make it happen, and those are the way that children behave. And you know what? That's okay, because it's just like Paul said, when you're coming up at the beginning, you're eating milk. You're not ready to go chew up a leg of lamb. Come on, you're going to be drinking milk, and it's like your mother's milk. And honestly, what does it say in the book of Revelations? It says Yeshua has women's breasts. What an odd thing to say. It says he is girded about the paps with a golden girdle. And the word paps is the word mastos, and that's where you get the word mastectomy from, which is a woman's breast. The man's breast has a different name in Greek. Almost an allusion to the fact that you're going to have to drink the milk of the breasts like a little baby. He even says, how are you going to come to him? You come to him as a child, as a baby child comes to him, and he'll raise you up. And when you're getting raised up, you don't start out knowing everything. You begin with a little tiny bit that you can deal with. You begin with the little moral lessons. You begin with the clear lines of, you may do this, you may not do this. Really, it's mostly just, you may not do this, you may not do this, you may not steal, you may not kill, you may not commit adultery, you may not give false testimony, you may not put any other god on a pedestal with him, you may not do whatever you want to on the Sabbath, etc., etc. I got 10 clear and distinct rules. Don't break them. Then you can move on to understanding the 613, which it took Maimonides, centuries after Christ to finally actually label them all out and say, in the Torah, these are the positive and negative commandments, 613. And then when you get done with that, you can go and study your 1,050 imperative voice statements made in the New Testament. And then you can decide, how many of them you're actually, supposed to be, obliquely obeying. You can't eat blood, you can't eat strangled animals, you cannot associate with people who are, of this certain type or that certain, don't be a fighter, don't be a brawler. There's so many suggestions, really, that Paul and the other apostles gave. They honestly are written as imperative statements where if you really wanted to, you could read them as commandments, commanding you not to be the way that you should not be. When it all boils down to it, it's really up to you. But again, as a baby child, you're getting led along, the path, and people are like, here's the path, try to walk on it, try to walk, here's your halakha, here's the walk, try to walk the path, little children, try to walk the path and do your best. And then over time, and I mean, I'm probably 13 years into this walk. I mean, I was raised in a church, crayon coloring pictures of Jesus on the cross, but that was baby child stuff. I walked away from him for probably 13 years, I guess. probably 14, probably two long cycles of 7. I walked away from him, and then the day I asked for help to come back, he immediately sent help. He didn't wait. He waited maybe 24 hours to bring in the help, just long enough for me to forget that I had prayed, for help. And he sent it. And now, I've did a few years in the Pentecostal church, doing a little holy rolling and tongue speaking, which was required because if you didn't speak in tongues, then you don't have the Spirit of God according to the doctrine, right? Did a couple years in a Baptist church as a youth pastor, the right-hand man of the senior pastor, and as a music minister. And then I started to keep the Sabbath, and then everything that I'd ever had before was taken from me, right? Because I made that mistake of putting that mark on me. And once I did that, I lost a house, and I've gained more than I had before. Everything that I lost, I've gained 7 times more. I mean, honestly, if I really look at it like that, it's like being Job. Thankfully, I didn't lose any children, but I didn't have any children before. I was given the children. I had long ago lost a wife, but I was given a better one. Given the wife of my youth. The wife of my youth was given to me. Somebody who I thought I would never even see again reappeared in my life, and now I'm married to her. I mean, that's mind blowing to even think that has happened. I did 7 years reading the Torah, basically living almost like a Karaite. Here I am reading the Torah, reading the Torah, reading the Torah, reading the Torah, reading the Torah. 7 solid years, keeping the feasts. I've been to 8 Sukkots, 7 solid years reading the Torah. And now, just now, I'm starting to learn about the history of the time, learning about the writings that the Jews of the time, that all this that means so much to me was occurring. I'm starting to learn what they knew. I'm starting to learn about the Mishnah. I'm starting to learn about the customs and the oral law at the time. I'm starting to see how Yeshua is a rabbi in the school of the Pharisees, probably under Hillel. But then again, Hillel was the prince of the Sanhedrin at the time. Everybody was under Hillel. And everybody was under Shammai, because he was the father of the Beit Din. He was the number 2 man. He was the vice president of the Sanhedrin. These are people who were influential at their time, who I'm starting just now to come to understand, starting just now to get a clearer look at, while looking at the Messiah and understanding why so many Jews at the time rejected him. Because, I came to him because the miraculous signs and wonders that he's done in my life. I literally said in my life, I'm not going to do anything. If you're real, you're going to have to raise me. If you're real, you're going to have to give me what I've got. And he did. He's given me so much. And he's given me so much responsibility, too. the most recent doors of my life only opened when I started fostering children, which was a requirement that he gave to me. I mean, he wants widows and orphans cared for. We were already doing a little widow caring for, but only a little. But these orphans are living in my house. I mean, and there's restrictions on what I can do, and it ain't always easy to love another man's children when you know that other man didn't care enough to come and take care of them. But one day he might. One day somebody might actually get their, ducks in a row and come and take these children who I'm caring for and loving and giving what I got to, and I'll have to give them up because they're not mine, They've just that. I guess in a sense it's like being a well. It's like being a well of living water, right? People come and drink from the well, drink from the well, drink from the well. They don't throw water back in the well. They just drink from it, and you have to accept that that's kind of the burden of being like Christ. The vultures are going to come where the dead are. And when you're hanging on a cross, which is exactly what we're supposed to do every day, the vultures are going to come around and occasionally going to pick a chunk off of you while you're alive and kicking, because there's nothing you can really do about it. And you just kind of accept it and just let him heal you and get back on that cross again. And that's all there is to it. So anyways, I hope everybody's learned a bunch today from the life and times of Jesus the Messiah. Today we read about Zacharias the priest and what was going on at the temple, and everything that transpired when he had his vision that's described in the Gospel of Luke. So be blessed. Baruch haba Yehovah, or Baruch haba Hashem, however you want to say it. I would prefer to say his name. I think we have enough archaeological and historical evidence to know what that name is now. But hey, if you want to call him the name, call him the name. I know who you're talking about, and I'm sure he does too. So be blessed and enjoy the rest of your day.